You are standing at the edge of the world. Behind you, a forest of dead trees. In front of you, nothing. A flat white nothing stretching to the horizon in every direction, broken only by wind. The temperature is negative 40 degrees. The sun has been below the horizon for 2 months, and you have no coat. This is not a thought experiment. For roughly 100,000 years, your ancestors lived through one of the most brutal climate events in the history of this planet, the Last Glacial Maximum. That's the technical term for it. The peak of the last ice age, when ice sheets up to 3 kilometers thick buried what is now Canada, Northern Europe, and much of Asia. Plain English. A wall of ice the height of a small mountain range swallowed entire continents. And humans not only survived it, they walked straight into it. The question is how? Modern people tend to imagine the Ice Age as something that happened to early humans, a catastrophe they endured. But the fossil record tells a different story. Archaeologist Paul Mellers of Cambridge University spent decades studying how humans moved through Ice Age Europe. And what he found in the stone layers was not a people in retreat. It was a people in motion. Deliberate, adaptive, organized. Your ancestors were not hiding from the cold. They were solving it. Start with the body. Your skin, right now, is essentially useless against serious cold. You have almost no fur. You can't generate enough heat to survive exposure below roughly 0 degrees Celsius for more than a few hours. You are, physiologically speaking, a tropical animal. That hasn't changed. The humans who walked into the Ice Age had the same body you have, which means the survival wasn't in their biology. It was in their minds. The first and most important thing they figured out, so fundamental it almost goes without saying except that it shouldn't, was clothing. Not just wrapping yourself in a skin. Engineered, layered, fabricated clothing. Archaeological sites from Ice Age Siberia, including the famous Sungir burial site dated to around 34,000 years ago, contained the remains of individuals buried with thousands of ivory beads stitched onto their garments. When researchers mapped the bead patterns, they revealed something stunning. Tailored clothing. Trousers, tunics, boots, hats. The stitching patterns were not decorative. They were functional seams designed to keep cold air out and body heat in. Think about what that means. Someone, tens of thousands of years ago, figured out that loose clothing kills you and tight-fitted layers keep you alive. And then they taught that to their children. And their children taught it to theirs. The cold didn't break your ancestors. It made them engineers. But clothing is only the beginning. Fire has been with your lineage for somewhere between 400,000 and 1 million years, depending on which archaeological site you believe. But Ice Age humans didn't just use fire for warmth. They managed it. They planned for it. Excavations at sites in southern France and northern Spain, Lascaux, Fond de Gaume, dozens of others, show hearts that were built, maintained, and revisited over long periods. These were not accidental fires. These were controlled environments. Researchers studying the P.A.S.T site in France, a mammoth hunter's camp from roughly 13,000 years ago, found hearths placed in specific locations relative to sleeping areas and wind direction. Your ancestors knew how to build a room out of heat, and they built actual rooms. Shelter during the Ice Age is where things get genuinely strange, because the materials they used were not what you'd expect. Wood was scarce across the open mammoth steppe, the vast cold grassland that stretched across Eurasia at the peak of the ice. So they built with bone. At Mezhirich in Ukraine, archaeologists uncovered the remains of several large dome-shaped structures built from the bones and tusks of at least 149 woolly mammoths. These weren't crude piles. They were engineered dwellings with thick insulating walls, built in shallow depressions that used the earth itself as insulation. The largest was roughly 8 meters across, big enough to shelter an extended family through a winter. Let that settle for a moment. Your ancestors looked at a dead mammoth and saw a house. Now consider food. This is where Ice Age survival gets most brutal, because the cold doesn't just threaten you directly. It threatens the entire food chain. Plants disappear under ice. Animals migrate or die. And yet human populations, though small, held on, and in some places expanded, through the worst of it. How? Part of the answer is the megafauna. The Ice Age world was full of very large animals: woolly mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave bears, giant deer, bison, horses, reindeer, prey animals of extraordinary size. A single woolly mammoth, which could weigh up to 6 tons, represented hundreds of thousands of calories. One successful hunt could feed a group of 20 people for weeks. And your ancestors hunted these animals with extraordinary sophistication. Researchers studying kill sites across the Eurasian steppe have found evidence of coordinated drives, groups working together to push herds toward cliffs, river crossings, or natural killing grounds. This wasn't luck. This was strategy, planning, communication complex enough to coordinate dozens of people across large distances. Anthropologist Gary Haynes has spent years analyzing mammoth kill sites in North America and Eurasia. His work suggests that mammoth hunters didn't just react to the animals they found. They tracked seasonal migration routes and positioned themselves accordingly. They were, in other words, anticipating the future, thinking months ahead. This kind of forward planning is something we associate with modern complex cognition. But your ancestors were doing it in the dark, in the cold, with spears. They also preserved food. Ice Age winters could last 8 months or more. No hunting during a blizzard, no plants to forage under 3 meters of snow. Survival required storage, and the cold itself became a tool. Permafrost, the permanently frozen ground layer beneath the surface, acted as a natural freezer. Evidence from sites in Siberia and Eastern Europe suggests that Ice Age groups cached meat and fat in permafrost pits, storing enough calories to survive the deepest winter months. The cold that was trying to kill them was also keeping their food fresh. And here is the counterintuitive truth that the Ice Age reveals about your ancestors. The harshest conditions in human history may have driven the greatest leap in human culture. This is not a romantic idea. It's a hypothesis backed by timing. The period of peak Ice Age cold, between roughly 30,000 and 20,000 years ago, coincides almost exactly with what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, a sudden explosion of symbolic thought, art, and cultural complexity. The cave paintings of Chauvet in France, dated to around 36,000 years ago, are not primitive scratches. They are sophisticated, dynamic, three-dimensional compositions that use the natural contours of the cave wall to give the animals depth and movement. Scholars like Jean Clotz, who spent years studying these paintings, describe them as evidence of minds fully capable of abstract thought, planning, storytelling, and imagination. Researcher Polly Wiesner, whose decades of fieldwork with the Kungsan of southern Africa produced landmark studies of hunter-gatherer social behavior, found something relevant here. She documented that in cold seasons, when food was scarce and nights were long, the amount of time spent in firelit conversation and storytelling rose dramatically. Nighttime talk around the fire was not idle chatter. It was the transmission of knowledge, stories about where the herds go in winter, which plants are safe under the snow, how to read the ice. The Ice Age didn't just pressure your ancestors physically. It pressured them to think together, to share what they knew, to become more human. The social dimension of Ice Age survival is impossible to overstate. No individual human could survive a Siberian winter alone. Not with the technology available, not with that body. Survival was collective by necessity. It required trust between people who weren't necessarily related. It required systems for sharing meat from a large kill. It required care for the injured, the elderly, and the very young. The Sungir burials in Russia, those elaborately clothed individuals with thousands of ivory beads, included the remains of 2 children buried head-to-head with extraordinary care. These weren't people who were left behind. They were honored. The social bonds that made Ice Age survival possible also created something that looks unmistakably like grief, ceremony, and love. So here is the picture. You wake up in a bone house on the Eurasian steppe. It is dark. It has been dark for a month. Outside, the wind is cutting across the ice sheet 100 miles to the north. You are wearing layered, stitched clothing made from the hides of animals your group killed together. You have food cached in the frozen ground. Someone in your group knows which direction the reindeer will come from when the temperature breaks, because their grandmother told them, who was told by hers. And tonight, around a hearth placed exactly where it deflects the wind, someone will tell that story again. That is how your ancestors survived the Ice Age, not by being stronger, not by being biologically different from you in any meaningful way, by being smarter, by being social, by turning the cold itself, the darkness, the scarcity, the pressure, into an engine of innovation. The Ice Age ended roughly 11,700 years ago. The glaciers retreated, the megafauna collapsed, and the people who had survived the cold walked out of it into a warmer world, carrying everything they had learned. You are standing at the edge of that world now, and everything you just heard, the planning, the cooperation, the stories passed down through fire, is still running in you. The same brain that designed a mammoth-bone house is the one reading these words. The cold is gone, but what it built never left.